Welcome back to Exploring the Divine Guide, the podcast where we dive deep into Muhammad Ali Amir-Moezzi's groundbreaking work on early Imamite doctrine. Today we are embarking on our third episode in this fascinating journey through one of the most important scholarly works on Twelver Shi'ism. Before we dive into today's topic, let me quickly remind you where we left off. In our previous episode, we explored the introduction to the Divine Guide, where Amir-Moezzi established his methodological framework for studying Imamology. We learned about the challenges of examining the earliest sources of Imamite doctrine, those direct teachings from the Imams themselves between the mid 7th and the early 9th centuries. Most importantly, we discussed four crucial methodological points that guide this entire study, with the first being the need to understand the concept of aql in the way that the Imams originally intended it, and not through later philosophical interpretations. So, this brings us perfectly to today's episode. Today, we're going to unpack one of the most fundamental concepts in early Imamite thought, the notion of aql, a term that's often translated as reason or intellect or intelligence, but as we will discover, carries meanings far richer and more complex than these translations suggest. And this isn't just an academic exercise. We're going to understand aql through how the Imams meant it to be understood. Because aql is the very tool and organ through which we first grasp the nature of divine guidance, and then through this very tool, we comprehend the teachings of the Imams. So let's talk about the complexity of aql. Aql is usually translated, depending on the context, as reason, intellect, intelligence, or even discernment. But these translations don't quite capture it. Amir-Moezzi says it is a complex and delicate notion that covers a great semantic field, meaning that single word translations are not going to capture the meaning. And this isn't simply a matter of translation difficulty. It reflects the rich, multifaceted nature of the concept itself, especially in the formative centuries of Islam before Islamic theology and philosophy became systematized. The closest English translation that Amir-Moezzi uses is the term Hiero-Intelligence. Hiero spelled here as Hiero, and which literally means sacred, something sacred or holy, suggesting that we're not dealing with just ordinary reason or intelligence, but something far more transcendent and spiritually charged. This complexity is so significant that modern scholars, scholars who study Islam and even the Arabs, continue to research and debate the precise early meaning of this term. We're dealing with a living, evolving concept that transformed dramatically over time. To understand the meaning of aql, we need to first investigate its origins, etymologically speaking. So in the etymology, the origin of the word gives us a beautiful metaphor, and it's quite revealing. Originally, aql referred to what was tied to an animal's feet to restrain it. Think about that image for a moment, a rope or a hobble that keeps an animal from wandering off. The abstract meaning that developed from this was the faculty that restrains human beings from foolishness, or restrains the human mind from wandering off into forbidden areas that could harm or even ruin them. Now, before Islam, in the pre-Islamic Arab culture, Aql had no special religious or philosophical importance. It simply meant good sense, or you might say practical wisdom. And it wasn't the dominant concept for wisdom or moral authority. That place and honor belonged to another word, Hilm, a much richer and more socially significant idea at that time, pre Islamic Arabia. So let's discuss the concept of Hilm and how it was used to effect a radical transformation in the definition of Aql. And what is the relation between the two? Hilm was central to Arab tribal mentality and encompassed what Amir-Moezzi describes as numerous character traits. And I'm going to quote from his book. He says, from serene justice and the measure of longanimity and indulgence to self-control and dignity of demeanor. Understand this. Let's break this down. Serene justice, the ability to make fair decisions calmly in a calm manner. Longanimity, patience in the face of suffering or provocation. Essentially, a long temper rather than a short one. Indulgence here means the wisdom to overlook minor faults in others. Self control is the mastery over one's impulses and emotions. And dignity of demeanor means carrying oneself with grace and composure. And Hilm, the meanings of Hilm encompassed all of these character traits. And this was enormously important in Arab tribal society. The person who possessed Hilm, especially tribal leaders called Sayyid, had unquestionable moral and social authority. This wasn't just respect, it was recognition of a kind of moral superiority. And here's the crucial point, it was Hilm, not Aql, that stood in opposition to Jahl and Safa. Now, Jahl is often translated as ignorance, but Amir-Moezzi gives us a more nuanced understanding. This isn't just not knowing something, it's guilty ignorance. The ignorance of someone who believes himself to be free of faults and who makes no distinction between what benefits him and what harms him. So, this is the willful, arrogant, or we even say compound ignorance. So, in pre Islamic Arabia, Hilm was the supreme virtue that distinguished the wise leader from the foolishly arrogant. Now, here comes the Quran, and everything changes with it. And although the noun aql itself never appears in the Quran, but the verbal form aqala yaqilu appears over 50 times. And in the Quran, aql appears alongside other crucial religious terms in similar grammatical structures. For example, tafakkara, to think about God's signs, tadakkara, to keep God in memory, to remembrance of God, sha'ara, to grasp intuitively the meaning of the signs of God, faqiya means to understand God's word, and alima, to recognize God's signs. So you notice what's happening here. Aql is in the Quran now operating in a completely religious semantic field. And it's completely different from the notion or the definition of aql that existed before Quran. It's no longer just practical good sense. It's become a faculty for perceiving the divine. So, what just happened is something remarkable. The Quran came and completely changed the definition of aql. Like we said, before Islam, aql didn't have any special religious or philosophical importance. It simply meant good sense. But after the revelation of the Quran, aql not only now takes the role of Hilm. Remember all those character traits that we talked about? So aql takes the role of Hilm. But more than that, the Quran also elevates it to a higher transcendent dimension. The Quranic aql, which is still opposed to Jahl, the ignorance of the impious or the compound ignorance that we talked about. So it's still opposed to Jahl, and this aql becomes what Amir-Moezzi describes as a kind of consciousness or perception of the divine. And this is extraordinary. Think about what this means. Aql isn't just thinking or reasoning in the way we might understand it today. It's a complex spiritual faculty that involves meditative reflection, intuition of divine signs, remembrance of God, deep knowledge, and ultimately submission to divine authority. It's a form of sacred intelligence, hence termed as Hiero-Intelligence by Moezzi, an intelligence that is able to perceive divine truths. So Aql becomes this complex spiritual faculty that allows humans to perceive, understand, and submit to the divine reality. Now we come to the heart of our story. Early Imamism, the original form of Twelver Shi'ism that we've been studying, took this Quranic definition of Aql. And as Amir-Moezzi puts it, it exploits this religious domain of Aql to the extreme. Meaning that the Imams didn't just use this concept, they made it absolutely central to their entire worldview, turning it into a capital aspect of its dogma in general, and of Imamism in particular. So remember, Imamology, the term coined by Amir-Moezzi, is the doctrine about the nature and role of the Imam, the divinely guided leader. So Aql becomes crucial not just for understanding Islamic teachings generally, but specifically for understanding who the Imam is and why he matters. According to the Imams themselves, and this is crucial because we're dealing with their own words, the explanation provided by the Imams themselves, and these are not later interpretations. So, in the words of the Imams, the Aql is the best, if not the only way to approach and understand their teachings. And let me repeat that because it's so important. What the Imams are saying is that without Aql, their teachings remain incompletely understood, ineffective, or even incomprehensible. And this tells us something profound about how the Imams understood their own role and their teachings. They weren't simply offering moral guidance or even theological instruction in the conventional sense. They were providing teachings that required a special form of sacred intelligence to properly understand. Now, how central was Aql to early Imamite doctrine? We have compelling evidence from one of the most important figures in Imamite scholarly tradition, Muhammad ibn Yaqub al-Kulayni, who passed away in 328 Hijri around the time of the 12th Imam's major occultation. Al-Kulayni compiled one of the most important collections of Imamite traditions called al-Kafi. Al-Kafi. And this work is massive. Amir-Moezzi calls it colossal. It's a massive work, and here's the telling detail. When al-Kulayni organized the dogmatic part of this colossal collection, he began with Kitab al-Aql wal-Jahal, the Book of Intelligence and Ignorance. And this wasn't arbitrary. Kulayni recognized that understanding Aql was absolutely fundamental to understanding everything else that would follow. And he's saying that before you can understand anything else about Imamite doctrine, you must first understand Aql. This organizational choice reflects the teaching of the Imams themselves, that Aql is the key that unlocks everything else, and without it, the rest of the doctrine remains closed to you. As we wrap up today's episode, I want you to consider what we've discovered about the evolution of Aql, meaning the evolution of the meaning that is ascribed to Aql. We started with a pre-Islamic concept, meaning simply good sense or practical wisdom that kept people away from foolishness. We saw how Hilm, not Aql, was the dominant concept for wisdom and moral authority in pre-Islamic Arab culture. The Quran transformed Aql into a religious faculty, a form of divine perception that involves reflective meditation, remembrance, intuition, and deep knowledge. And early Imamism took this religious concept of Aql and made it absolutely central to the doctrine, claiming that without this sacred form of intelligence, the Imam's teachings cannot be properly understood. And this evolution reveals something crucial about early Imamite self-understanding. The Imams weren't presenting themselves merely as religious leaders or even as interpreters of Islamic law. They were presenting teachings that required a special form of consciousness, a Hiero-Intelligence, to comprehend. Amir-Moezzi tells us that a thematic analysis of the traditions in al-Kulayni's Book of Aql and Ignorance, or Book of Aql and Jahl, will help us to better grasp how the Imams defined the crucial concept. And that analysis will form part of our future episodes, inshallah. But for now, I want to leave you with this question. What does it mean for a religious tradition to claim that its core teachings require not just faith or learning, but a special form of sacred intelligence to understand? How does this change our understanding of the Imam's role and the nature of religious authority in early Imamism? Thank you for joining me for this deep dive into the concept of Aql, the sacred intelligence that lies at the heart of early Imamite doctrine. Next time, we'll continue our exploration of the Divine Guide, building on this foundation to understand even more about how the early Imams explained themselves and their teachings. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking that sacred intelligence that bridges the human and the divine. Wassalam.